There is a false sense of security that always exists when you are sitting in a car with the doors locked at night. You drift through the pitch-black darkness. You are wrapped in a shell of metal and tempered glass. You believe that the outside world cannot reach you. I used to think that way every time I heard the sound of tires gripping the wet asphalt at midnight. But all those beliefs shattered on a winter night in 2018. That was when I was driving on Interstate 84, cutting through the state of Oregon. That night permanently stripped away my peace of mind whenever I have to get behind the wheel after the sun goes down. Everything started at a time when my life was falling into a complete mess. I had just lost my job and ended a 3-year relationship in the same week. There was no reason left to stay. I decided to rent a U-Haul trailer. I packed all of my belongings into it and hooked it to the back of my SUV. My goal was to move to Portland. That was where I hoped I could rebuild my life from scratch. By then, I had been driving for over a dozen hours straight. My body was completely exhausted and sleep-deprived. I could only force my eyes to stay open with gulps of black coffee and a few energy drinks bought in a rush along the way. The only person keeping me from falling asleep at that moment was Lucas. He is my younger brother. We had been keeping a call open via the car's Bluetooth connection for many hours. Lucas was at home, very far away from me, but his voice was the only psychological anchor that kept me alert in the middle of the endless night. "Are you sure you don't want to pull over and get some shut-eye?" Lucas's voice came through the car speakers with a look of concern. "I'm fine. I just need to drive a bit further, and I'll be clear of this stretch," I replied to him. I tried to keep my tone as calm as possible. The truth was that I was incredibly exhausted. But I didn't want to stop in the middle of a deserted highway surrounded by dark woods like this. We just continued with our mundane daily chatter. The space inside the car remained incredibly warm and safe. I had no idea that all that peace was just a play about to reach its final act. I pulled the car into a gas station in Pendleton, just as the clock on the dashboard struck 1 in the morning. The place was fairly crowded, but carried a messy and grime-streaked atmosphere. I stepped out of the car to stretch my limbs and walked into the convenience store to buy another cup of coffee. Before heading inside, I circled to the back to check the trailer hitch on the U-Haul. That was when I noticed him. There was a man in a worn-out coat, standing right next to the public payphone. He wasn't looking at the phone or watching the traffic. His eyes were glued to my every movement in a blatant way. He stood there and stared at me as if he were evaluating his prey. My intuition immediately sounded an alarm that something was wrong, but the logic of an exhausted person quickly brushed that feeling aside. I told myself that he was just one of the many harmless drifters who often gather at highway rest stops. I paid for the coffee and quickly got back into the car and locked the doors. I pressed the gas, blending the vehicle back onto Interstate 84. The fog began to roll in and grew thicker by the minute. The cars heading in the same direction thinned out and then vanished completely into the opaque night. I was left alone, driving through the winding, empty mountain passes. A few minutes later, I glanced at the rearview mirror. I spotted a pair of dim headlights tailing me from far behind. That car kept a constant distance from my rear bumper. It had no intention of speeding up to pass, nor did it fall further behind. I told Lucas about it over my headset. "There's a car that's been following me for a while." Lucas paused for a moment before offering advice. "You're just too exhausted. It could just be an illusion caused by highway hypnosis. Just focus on looking straight ahead." I wanted to believe my brother, but the unease in my chest kept growing. Every time I tapped the brakes to take a curve, the headlights behind me blinked in a strange rhythm. That coincidence didn't feel like random road traffic. It felt like a silent confirmation that this tailing was entirely intentional. I swallowed hard and tightened my freezing hands around the steering wheel. The fog outside the car became increasingly thick and stifling. My vision was narrowed down to just a few feet in front of me. Around 3:30 in the morning, I felt my eyelids growing heavy. My brain felt like a taut string about to snap. I was no longer alert enough to continue handling the steering wheel for even a minute longer. I decided to pull the car into a rest stop, sitting alone in the middle of a pine forest. This parking lot was vast and pitch black. There was only one long-haul truck parked far away in the corner with its engine off. I kept the engine running to keep the cabin warm. I told Lucas to stay on the line and hurried into the public restroom to splash my face with water. The silence of the rest stop at that moment enveloped everything. Each of my footsteps, hitting the hard asphalt, became too heavy. The sound of wind whistling through the pine branches created a pressure that weighed heavily on my psyche. I tried to do everything as quickly as possible to return to the car. As soon as I got back to the front of the vehicle, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a square piece of paper tucked tightly under the windshield wiper. I took that paper and looked at it under the dim light. It was a Polaroid photo taken in low-light conditions. In the photo was a shot of me standing with my back to the lens. I was at the gas pump at the Pendleton station, over 100 miles back. The person tailing me hadn't just followed me along this long journey. He had gotten close enough to snap that photo without me ever knowing. All boundaries of my personal safety had been completely shattered. I grabbed my phone in a panic and described the photo to Lucas. Lucas's voice on the other end of the line also began to tremble. He confirmed that this was no longer just the paranoia of an exhausted driver. This threat had truly and directly entered my personal life. I scrambled into the driver's seat and locked every door instantly. The panic made my limbs tremble violently. I tried to reconnect the call with Lucas, but my phone screen showed zero signal. The cellular signal had completely vanished in the middle of these mountains. The call with my brother cut off abruptly, leaving me in a state of total isolation. The very next second, the car's dashboard screen flashed to life. The vehicle's Bluetooth system unexpectedly received an incoming call from a hidden number. In my utter panic, I instinctively pressed the answer button on the steering wheel. The other end of the line remained silent. No voice responded to me at all. There was only steady and slow breathing coming through the car's speaker system. I looked out the window through the thick fog, but saw no one. I glanced into the rearview mirror to check behind me. Everything inside the cabin was deathly still and terrifying. Suddenly, the speakers emitted a hoarse and very close whisper. The voice murmured simple words, "Knock the doors." I froze in place as I realized the horrific truth. That sound did not come from outside the car windows or from other vehicles on the road. It came from right behind my back. I stared intensely into the rearview mirror. I realized in horror that the person tailing me had not been driving behind me on the highway. He had picked the lock and hidden inside the U-Haul trailer, containing all my belongings, since we were at the Pendleton gas station. He had been traveling with me throughout the long journey in the darkness, and now he was right behind me, separated by only a thin partition. I slammed on the gas and tore the SUV and the U-Haul trailer frantically out of the rest stop. I drove at a breakneck speed through the thick fog, aiming for the nearest police station. Behind my back, the partition of the U-Haul trailer echoed with rhythmic thuds, as if someone was desperately trying to break through from the inside. I didn't dare to stop. I didn't dare to look in the rearview mirror even once more. As dawn began to break, I drove straight into the parking lot of the town's police station. Officers rushed toward me with weapons drawn when they heard my tires screeching to a halt. They ordered me to stay put and quickly approached the U-Haul trailer at the rear. But when they broke the lock and threw the trailer doors wide open, the inside was completely empty. All of my belongings had been tossed and scattered everywhere. The trailer's locking mechanism had been bent and forced from the inside. All that remained was the overpowering stench of cheap cigarettes lingering in the air and a Polaroid camera lying abandoned on the wooden floor. The person had jumped out of the trailer when I slowed down at some intersection in the night. He had vanished completely into the darkness of the Oregon mountains. The subsequent investigation led nowhere. The police found no fingerprints or any suspicious identity. I moved to Portland and started a new life, but peace of mind had abandoned me forever. Lucas always insists that I video call him whenever I step out in the evening. We never bring up that night again, but I know both of us have changed. Now, whenever I drive at night and hear any strange noises coming from the back of the car, I break into a cold sweat. I grip the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turn white. I have learned a painful lesson for myself. Never ignore your own intuition. When you are driving alone in the dark, the scariest thing is not that someone might be following you. It is that they have already crept into your private space and have been traveling with you all along without you even knowing. There are some mornings that pass by so quietly you don't even pay attention, until time drags you back and forces you to look straight at what happened. I still carry the feeling of that day inside me, even though I'm thousands of miles away from that place now. It all started with a dry clicking sound coming from the mirror hanging in my bedroom. At the time, I just thought it was the temperature changing, causing the wooden frame to expand or contract. Looking back now, I realize it wasn't the wood. It was the faint tapping of something trying to break the boundary between two worlds that I mistakenly thought were safe. Back then, I had just moved into this apartment in downtown Chicago after a messy breakup. Everything in my life was in a state of transition, and unopened cardboard boxes were cluttered in the corner of the room. The apartment had high ceilings and large windows, but the strangest part was the old mirrors covered tightly with yellowed newspaper from decades ago. I had been living there for a few weeks with Mark, my best friend. He was a practical guy, always keeping me grounded when I started overthinking weird things. We used to sit by the window drinking beers, watching the busy crowd down on the street, believing we were just enjoying the freedom of our youth. Everything started to change on a pouring rainy afternoon. A middle-aged couple moved into the apartment across the hall, bringing along a boy about 10 years old. That child was unlike any other kid I had ever seen. He stood quietly in the hallway without looking anywhere, his eyes completely blank, as if staring right through the walls. The boy wore a thick sweater, even though the weather was stifling hot. When I accidentally caught his eye, I noticed a strange bruise running from under his collar up to his ear. He didn't cry or smile, just standing there like a forgotten toy in the dark hallway. Mark started to notice strange sounds coming from the opposite apartment at night. It wasn't the sound of arguing, but a rhythmic, steady tapping, as if someone was trying to communicate using Morse code through the wall. As for me, I became obsessed with the mirrors in my room. I decided to peel off the newspaper layers to see if they were damaged. The mirror was old and stained, but my reflection inside didn't seem to completely match what I was doing. When I reached up to run a hand through my hair, the shadow in the mirror was half a second late, a delay that sent a cold chill down my spine. I told Mark about it, but he just frowned and said it was because of sleep deprivation. But we both knew something was completely wrong in this building. We started keeping a discreet eye on the apartment across the hall. The middle-aged man looked polite on the surface, but his eyes were always darting around suspiciously every time he stepped out. Once, I saw him tightly grip the boy's arm, his fingernails digging deep into the child's flesh, making him groan softly in pain. Unable to hold back any longer, I stepped out of my room. Mark followed right behind me, his phone already out and ready to record from a distance. I blocked the man's path right in front of the elevator door. I asked the child if he was okay, and immediately the man's gaze shifted from cold to pure violence. He snapped at my face with a sound that felt more like a guttural growl than a normal human voice. I didn't back down. Even though my heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I stood right between him and the boy, forcing him to let go of the child's arm immediately. Mark started raising his voice, demanding the man to stop unless he wanted the police to show up here. At that exact moment, the man froze and looked straight into my eyes. It wasn't the look of an angry father, but the glare of something predatory on the hunt. He smiled, a grin that showed absolutely no movement in his facial muscles, and said, "You will regret looking at things that don't belong to you." Then, he dragged the child back into the apartment and slammed the door shut with a force that shook the entire hallway. The police stormed into the opposite apartment with their weapons ready. The sound of the door being bashed in was so violent, it shook the old hallway of the building. When they broke down the door, Mark and I tried to peek through the gap to see what was happening inside. The apartment was completely empty and strangely freezing cold. There was no furniture, no signs of daily life. Only mirrors lined up against every single wall. Every single one of those mirrors was covered tightly with layers of old yellowed newspapers. The poor boy was curling up in the corner of the room, his eyes staring blankly into nothingness. The man had vanished completely without leaving any escape route. Even the windows were tightly shut and sealed from the inside. The officers found dozens of folders scattered all over the floor containing photos of many different strangers. They informed us that this was a large-scale kidnapping case, and this child was the last victim rescued from the hideout of this criminal ring. When I returned to my room and accidentally looked into the largest mirror, I suddenly understood everything. The newspaper layers taped over those mirrors weren't meant to protect them, but to stop whatever was existing inside the glass from escaping. That boy wasn't just a victim of physical abuse. He had been trapped between reality and the distorted reflection of those mirrors. All of his terrifying silence and blank expression were the result of being forced to exist between two worlds. My intervention didn't just save the child, but inadvertently shattered the balance that the kidnapper had meticulously maintained to feed something living inside the mirror glass. The police cordoned off the building, but the aftermath of the incident kept haunting me every single night. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep out of fear of looking into any mirror in the house. I constantly felt like a pair of eyes was watching me from behind the glass, waiting for a single moment of distraction to switch places with me. The sense of unease was no longer a vague suspicion. It had become a permanent part of my life. I realized I was incredibly lucky not to be the next person dragged into those mirrors. The apartment is empty now, but every time I walk past the bedroom, I still hear a faint tapping on the glass. It is a constant reminder that this world has far more dark corners than we could ever imagine. Now, whenever I sit in a coffee shop, I find myself carefully observing the people around me. I am no longer the carefree young guy I used to be. I understand that silence is sometimes not a virtue, but an invisible complicity. If you see a child with a distant look in their eyes, or a stranger who constantly avoids mirrors, listen to your intuition. My actions that day changed that boy's fate, and it completely changed how I look at life. Speak up when you feel something is wrong, because the price of silence is often much higher than you can imagine. Never ignore what your instinct warns you about, because sometimes the line between safety and danger is as fragile as a pane of mirror glass. There are some fragments of memory so strange that you never want to touch them again. They just hover there, blurring the line between a bad nightmare and a cruel reality that your mind actively tries to reject. Even to this day, I still cannot fully explain what actually happened that night. All that remains in my head is a lingering chill down my spine and a suffocating feeling that makes it hard to breathe. A steady, low buzz kept humming from the broken, old intercom system. The dim yellow neon light on the toll booth ceiling kept flickering constantly in a slow, unnatural rhythm. That weak light was barely enough to chase away the surrounding darkness. It only made the space feel much more eerie. I did not know that something wrong was approaching. I just felt a strange heaviness taking over the entire area. A sense of dread welled up in my throat, warning me that my safe boundary was being threatened. Back then, during that summer, my life revolved around completely ordinary things. I took a job as a night shift attendant at an old isolated highway toll booth in rural Pennsylvania. It was the only way for a broke college student like me to scrape together enough money for the next semester's tuition. The job itself was incredibly tedious and repetitive, night after night. At 11 o'clock that night, Marcus, the guy on the previous shift, packed up his things to hand over the station to me. He patted my shoulder and pointed toward the corner of the room where an old, dusty shortwave radio sat. Marcus gave me a warning with a pretty serious look on his face. "Hey, keep an eye on that radio. The circuit blew a long time ago, but sometimes it just starts blasting white noise out of nowhere. It will give you a massive headache." I just nodded with a polite smile and told him not to worry, to go home early to his family. The first few hours of the shift passed in the absolute silence of the wilderness. Only a few cargo trucks drove through, their drivers tossing a few coins before quickly vanishing into the dark. Everything was going completely normal, following its usual, harmless routine. But right when the clock struck 3 in the morning, the weather suddenly changed in a bizarre way. A thick, freezing fog rolled in from nowhere, completely swallowing the lonely highway. The fog was incredibly dense, thick like milk, completely blocking any visibility past 10 feet. If I stretched my hand out of the toll booth window, I could not even clearly see my own 5 fingers. The entire space was completely isolated from the civilized world outside. The sharp contrast between a normal job to make a living and the oppressive silence of the night started to suffocate my mind. My survival instinct kicked in hard, constantly whispering that I was all alone in a glass trap with only one way out. A low, muffled engine growl suddenly broke the silence of the fog. That sound slowly advanced into my toll lane. I strained my eyes to look through the blurry protective glass of the booth. An old, matte, dark gray sedan gradually emerged from the white void. Its roof and body were covered in road dust and streaks of dried mud. The car did not have its headlights on at all. It moved sluggishly like a ghost gliding through the desolate night. The person behind the wheel stopped the car right next to my toll cabin. He did not roll his window down all the way like regular drivers do. He only cracked it open just enough to leave a small gap at the edge. A thin, gaunt arm reached out through that narrow opening. He held out a rough brown leather wallet covered in dirt. I felt a strange chill radiating from the driver's bizarre behavior. I reached my hand through the small window of the toll booth to take the wallet. I figured I needed to check the cash inside to process the toll. When I opened the wallet, under the flickering yellow neon light, I found no cash inside. The only thing sitting in the middle slot was a dusty, dry ID card. I wiped away the layer of dust on the card's surface with my finger. My heart sank and my entire body froze when I read the name printed on it. Sarah Miller. That was my biological older sister. She had gone missing without a trace exactly 5 years ago in this very state. Shocked, I looked up to ask the driver where the wallet came from, but the gap in the window had already been rolled back up at some point. The person behind the wheel remained completely motionless, like a shadow in the dark cabin. In a panic, I pounded my fist repeatedly against his car window. "Hey, who are you? Why do you have this? Answer me right now." Despite me slamming on the glass until it hurt, the man did not move at all. He did not turn his head to look at me even once. He showed absolutely no reaction to my shock and anger. I tried to rationalize that someone had just accidentally picked up this wallet somewhere along the road. But that sequence of terrifying, deliberate silence meant I could no longer deceive myself. The warning instincts in my body were firing harder than ever before. The muffled low growl of the dark gray sedan's engine kept idling, spewing out thick exhaust fumes. The rhythmic pulse of the exhaust cutting through the dense fog created an oppressive weight in the air. The toll barrier had already been automatically lifted all the way up for a long time. Yet the car remained completely still, blocking the lane instead of moving forward. The anonymous driver's silent standstill escalated, turning into an invisible, heavy threat. The distance between the danger and me was now nothing more than a thin pane of toll booth glass. I felt as though I could hear the person breathing inside, even though the car windows were rolled up tight. The tension inside the cramped booth suffocated my chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. I knew I couldn't just stand there helplessly and wait for them to make the first move. With trembling hands, I picked up the intercom on the desk to contact the central station 2 miles away. I needed to report this bizarre incident immediately to seek emergency assistance. I wanted them to check the license plate of this sedan on the highway's traffic surveillance system. "Central, do you copy? I have a vehicle refusing to move in lane 2. The driver is behaving extremely suspiciously." However, there was no familiar response from the dispatcher on the other end. The communication line was suddenly violently disrupted by a bizarre, metallic clicking sound that hurt my ears. A raspy, broken voice came directly out of the small speaker of the intercom. "I finally found you." That terrifying voice startled me so badly that I dropped the intercom onto the floor. Cold sweat broke out, pouring down my spine as my legs began to shake uncontrollably. I quickly pulled my personal cell phone out of my pocket to dial the county police, but the screen only displayed a hopeless message, indicating that there was no service. The cellular signal was completely dead due to the remote location and the heavy blanket of thick fog. A wave of helplessness and pure terror welled up, choking my throat. I bitterly realized that I was completely isolated inside this tiny glass box in the middle of the vast darkness. No police officers, no coworkers, and no help from the outside world could ever reach me in time. The behavior of the person sitting in that car had completely crossed the line of a mere coincidence. This was clearly a calculated trap, a direct threat to my life. I knew I couldn't afford to panic or break down anymore. I had to force myself into an active defensive state before the worst took place. I quickly checked and securely locked both entry doors of the toll booth, using the heavy iron latches inside. I bent down beneath the dusty, cobweb-covered control desk. I pulled out an old wooden baseball bat that was kept there and gripped it tightly in my sweaty palm. I stood pressed against the dark corner of the wall, raising the bat in a defensive stance, bracing myself for a life-or-death confrontation. In a state of sheer panic, I decided I had to see the face of the person threatening me. I reached over and flipped the switch for the toll station's high-powered floodlights. A powerful beam of white light cut through the thick fog, shining directly into the cabin of the black sedan. The light pierced through the misty windows, revealing a truth that made my blood run cold. The person behind the wheel was actually nothing more than a lifeless plastic mannequin. It was dressed in a worn, tattered jacket as a disguise. The mannequin's head and hands were tightly wired to a crude system of cables running straight to the back seat. This proved that the car was being controlled entirely from afar by an anonymous operator. Instantly, a loud metallic clang echoed right behind my back. Someone had just used a heavy iron chain to lock the toll booth door from the outside. The entire power grid of the toll station shut down completely. Pitch darkness collapsed over me, swallowing me into the surrounding fog. The backup battery-powered security monitor flickered with its last faint glow. Through the static-filled screen, I watched in horror as a gaunt figure crawled down from the roof of the toll booth. He raised a short axe high and slammed it repeatedly against the glass right in front of my face. The blunt impacts echoed as the protective glass began to shatter into a spiderweb pattern. Amidst the chaos, the broken radio in the corner of the room suddenly turned on by itself. It played an old audio recording in my sister's exact voice. "Don't open the door. He isn't in the car. He is on the roof." Those words revealed a cruel reality that choked away all my hopes of survival. The remote-controlled car and the plastic mannequin were nothing more than bait. His goal was to keep me pinned down right in the blind spot of this toll booth. The killer from all those years ago did not just happen to show up tonight by chance. He had been planning, tracking, and hunting me long before staging this horrific trap. I was lucky enough to survive that horrific night due to a completely random coincidence. A state police patrol car had accidentally taken my toll lane because the fog was too dense. The loud, blaring siren echoing from a distance startled the man on the roof. He immediately abandoned his axe and vanished straight into the darkness of the thick woods running along the highway. By the time the police broke the lock on the booth door to rescue me, I had already collapsed onto the floor in a state of sheer panic. I submitted my resignation first thing the next morning, without even waiting for my final paycheck. I packed up all my belongings and took the earliest flight to move to a major city on the West Coast. It was the only way for me to try and escape the dark memories suffocating my mind. About 3 weeks later, a detective from Pennsylvania called to give me an update on the case. They had found the culprit's hideout deep in the dense woods right next to the toll station. Inside that makeshift shack, they uncovered Sarah's old wallet, along with many of her other personal documents. But what sent a severe chill down my spine was a collection of stalker photos of me, pinned all over the wooden walls. He had been silently tracking me for a week before the attack took place, precisely logging every single timestamp of my shifts. The events of that night left a massive psychological scar and completely altered my daily behavior. I became intensely paranoid about my personal safety everywhere I set foot. Whenever I walk into a room, an office, or a coffee shop, my very first action is always to locate and check the emergency exits. I constantly double-check the house locks 3 times before going to bed and never open the door for strangers. Now, whenever I see thick blankets of fog starting to roll past my window at night, my body automatically begins to shiver. It is as if I can still hear the clicking sound of the cables controlling the mannequin and that haunting, raspy voice echoing in my mind. I finally found you. The mystery of the man on the roof that night will forever remain a dark, unanswered void in my life. The police never managed to catch him, and his mugshot stays buried in the pile of cold case files. He is still out there, hiding somewhere, perhaps standing under a different blanket of fog, watching a brand new target. I am telling this story not just to provoke cheap scares, but as a genuine warning for you. Your body's survival instinct always holds an absolute protective value, even when you do not have any clear evidence in hand. Never try to rationalize or ignore a sudden chill running down your spine. Always trust your gut, because safety sometimes only comes from choosing to defend yourself before it is too late.